Hello, I'm Dr. Jill Campo, and today we will be discussing various theories within human development. Your book does a nice job of going over these theories, but it doesn't go into them in too much depth. However, I think they're very foundational for the rest of this class, so I wanted to be spending a few minutes discussing them with you. Now, a theory of development, any theory for that matter, will describe, explain, and predict behavior. More specifically to human development, these theories are seeking to address how do people become who they become. We all have these ideas kind of floating around in our head, but there are specific theories that your book mentions, and which we're going to talk about today, that really dive into understanding how we develop as humans. As we proceed, I have a few questions for you to consider related to this. Firstly, does this theory that I'll be presenting, does it discuss real-world facts about children and adults? Or does it address and seek to explain various assumptions, terms, or issues that are related to human development? Can it predict future events? Is it valid? Is it practical? Is it testable? Can it accommodate new information? And lastly, does it stimulate new ideas and testable research? Now, of course, the various theories we're going to talk about today, they are pretty time-tested, meaning they are around for a reason. They do a pretty accurate job of explaining human development. But they're all going to come in from various angles, and so it's important that you have at least a general idea of each of them as you proceed in the course. So beginning, we will start with psychoanalytic theories. I'll briefly cover Freud and then dive in a little bit more specifically into Erik Erikson's theory. For cognitive theories, those theories that are really trying to understand how individuals develop in terms of their thinking, we will discuss Piaget, Vygotsky, and also information processing approaches. Next, we will discuss behaviorism and social cognitive theories. That primarily means we'll talk about operant conditioning and social learning theory as proposed by Albert Bandura. And then lastly, we'll briefly mention ethological theory and also ecological systems theory. So let's begin where it all started, and that's with Sigmund Freud. Now, most of you, when you think of Freud, you think of his ideas of the id, ego, and superego, or maybe what you've learned about an introduction to psychology. But Freud actually was also the first to develop a theory of human development, and so for that we do give him credit. In his theory, he did put a pretty heavy emphasis on the unconscious, which you may remember if you took Introduction to Psychology. And the idea here is that there are motivating factors that are lying underneath the surface that we're not aware of. And Freud thought that many of the events of our childhood would impact us later as we grow into adults. Now, he did have a theory that he called the psychosexual theory, and it's going to put a heavy emphasis on sexual instincts. You can read more about this in your text, but there are 5 different stages: the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital periods of development. We're not going to get into those specifically, but I do think it's important to mention that Freud set the stage for the periods of development that we still use today. For instance, the oral period was from 0 to 1. That's what we refer to as infancy. The anal period was the toddler years. The genital period was the years of adolescence. And so even though a lot of the key ideas and concepts in his theory aren't really well represented by what research says, he did get the ball rolling and starting to talk about human development. Now, Erik Erikson was Freud's predecessor, and as opposed to being a psychoanalytic theorist, he kind of takes a step further, and he's what we call a neo-Freudian, and he has a psychosocial theory of human development. He did, even though he studied under Freud, he did diverge from Freud, and I think in a healthy way, as opposed to focusing on conflict that was more sexual in nature. Erikson is going to focus on conflict that occurs more in our relationships and more in our understanding of who we are. I really like this image because it goes over the 8 stages that Erikson gives of human development. Now, you may remember Freud, he had 5 stages that went through adolescence. Erikson is going to take it a step further. He has 8 stages that really is a lifespan approach to understanding development. His stages go all the way from the infancy years to late adulthood. Now, in trust versus mistrust, this is during infancy, and this is whenever a child recognizes if they can trust their caregivers or if they are going to lack that trust because maybe some of their needs are not being met. During the toddler years, about 1 to 3, we go through autonomy versus shame and doubt. Now, autonomy basically means that a child is going to be able to start doing things more on their own. Sometimes we say this is autonomy support because parents are obviously still greatly involved in the child's development during these years. Some of the basic things that a child is doing at this time would include toilet training and just starting to kind of exert more control over their body and will. Now, during the preschool years, children go through the stage of initiative versus guilt. This is when the child again can start exploring their world, or are they going to feel guilt and kind of not understanding who they are and the fact that maybe their parents are reprimanding them a little bit too much? Or can they show initiative? They kind of have their own purpose and ideas and interests. During grade school, we go through industry versus inferiority. This is where we develop a sense of competence, an idea of I know who I, or where I, like what I'm good at. You may think back to your own elementary school years, and maybe you were part of the basketball team, or maybe you were in the band. But as long as kids can have one thing that they're very competent at, they will have a sense of industry. If kids don't have this sense of, oh, I'm good at something, then they will begin to feel inferior. During the teenage or adolescent years, we go through identity versus role confusion. This is when we're asking questions such as, who am I? Where do I fit in? What do I want to be as I get older? It's important that during these years, and even now, current research says we do this more during the college years or what we call emerging adulthood, that we're beginning to understand who we are and what we value. During young adulthood, Erikson said we were in intimacy versus isolation. This had to do with love relationships, but also just understanding how we relate to others, even in friendships. Are we the type of person that wants to be known and understood by others and engaged in relationships, or would we rather be more isolated? The next stage, stage 7, is generativity versus stagnation. This occurs in middle adulthood as we can either start thinking more outside ourselves and giving back. That's what it means to have generativity. Or is it still kind of all about us? That's what stagnation is. And then lastly, in old age, as we prepare for death, we'll go through a stage that Erikson termed integrity versus despair. Did we live a life well lived? Are we happy with the decisions we've made? Or are we in despair over those choices? So that just gives you a brief understanding of Erikson's theory. I think as we go throughout the rest of the course and we go through these various time periods, you'll be able to apply these both to what the text is talking about, but also to your own life. Let's move forward into the cognitive theories. We're first going to discuss Piaget, then Vygotsky, and then the information processing approach. Piaget is a very famous psychologist. If you take an education class, you will talk about him. If you take other classes in psychology, you may discuss him as well. He has a cognitive developmental theory, and he believed that children actively construct knowledge by interacting with the world around them. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, what Piaget thought was that kids needed to be actively engaged in their learning process. They needed to discover the world around them. And when he says construct, it's kind of similar to building a house. Brick by brick or knowledge by knowledge, we are building what we know. Whenever we're a baby, we don't know very much. But over time, we start to learn more and more and more. And so we have these amazing constructions of knowledge within us. Now, some key terms here would be that Piaget said that we organize our experiences into what he called schemas. He also thought that we could adapt these schemas over time, so we can pull new information into our schemas, or we can even change and modify our schemas. One other side note, something that I like about Piaget, is that he developed his theory based off of his own three children. He did extensive research over them, and he actually called kids little scientists, meaning that kids were always out exploring the world around them. Similar to what I did with Erikson, I just want to really briefly go over Piaget's 4 stages. We will go over these much more thoroughly over the semester, but it's important to have a framework. The first stage is from birth to 2 years, and this is called the sensory motor stage. If you've ever seen a young infant, they're often putting everything into their mouth. Well, that goes right along with the sensory motor stage. Kids are interacting with their environment through their senses. So kids are using their ears, their eyes, their hands, and their mouth to make sense of their world. Kids don't yet have language capacity, or at least it's not fully developed at the time, and so they're going to actually use their senses more to think. Now, by around the age of 2, kids start to use language, and what a mental representation is it's basically an idea for something that you see in the world. You have, if I say shoe, well, you don't need to see a picture of a shoe to know what it is. You have an idea in your head of what a shoe is. That's mental representation. From 2 to 7, this ability continues to grow and grow and grow. We'll talk more about this time period later, but it's important to recognize that language is a huge part of this time. Now, the concrete operational stage is from 7 to 11, and this is whenever children begin to think much more logically. You're starting to use more reason behind your thought. This is very similar to the grade school years where you are just piling in basic facts and knowledge about the world around you. And then lastly, the formal operation stage, beginning around age 11, is when we start to develop formal, or I should say abstract thought. Abstract thought basically means that we can think about things that aren't specifically in front of us. This is where we start to ask deeper questions. We start to ask, what's the meaning of life? What happens to me after I die? Some of these deeper questions that a 4 or 5-year-old would really not be asking. And if they did, they wouldn't know how to think about it as deeply as somebody in the adolescent or adult years. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of Piaget. As I said before, as we talk about each of these age ranges, we will go over this stage much more in much more advanced language. Let's move into Vygotsky. Vygotsky was actually a contemporary of Piaget. He was writing around the 1930s as well. He was a Russian psychologist, and unfortunately, his work, he passed away at the age of 38, and so a lot of his work really wasn't well understood until the late 70s, early 80s. Much of his work was not translated into English until after the Cold War, and so we really didn't have a good understanding of him until more recently. Now, his bigger question was saying, can you understand behavior with understanding the context? He has a famous quote that through others we become ourselves. And he saw other people as very important into the development of who we are. And so he's also a cognitive theorist, but he's going to emphasize how others play a huge role in how you understand the world around you. Some of this would be the transmission of culture, your various beliefs, values, and customs. They are often specific to the culture you live in. For instance, if you grew up in Missouri, you may know more about Missouri than somebody who grew up in California. Or if you grew up in the U.S., you likely know much more about U.S. history than somebody who grew up in Germany. Vygotsky is also going to emphasize the importance of social interaction and how interacting with others helps us advance in terms of what we know. And then lastly, he's going to emphasize language. He thought that both verbal and nonverbal forms of communication were very important for our understanding of who we are, but also how we think. The last cognitive theory is the information processing approach. Now, this is really more of an approach than a specific theory of human development. It's used in the broader realms of psychology, not just human development. And it's going to continue to emphasize how we think. Now, one of the kind of hallmarks of the information processing approach is that they compared the human mind to that of a computer. And so this was very popular in the 70s and 80s when computers were first coming out. But they used a lot of flow charts and kind of thinking about how we store information, similar to how you would store information on your hard drive, or how you can retrieve information, similar to how you would open up a file on your computer. Some of the concepts over this class that we may discuss would be perception, particularly in infancy, also things like attention, memory, how we categorize information, how we plan for future events, how we problem solve, and also how we comprehend. There is a lot of research behind the information processing approach, and so as you read your text this semester, you will likely read a lot of research that has utilized information processing. Now let's take a step back and move into a whole nother realm of theories, and that would be behaviorism. Behaviorism is going to be very different than the other theories. Unlike Freud, who thought that there was the unconscious and that we always had these kind of internal motivating factors, behaviorism was kind of an extreme approach in the opposite direction. This is a very westernized view of human development, and it started out with a man named John Watson. Now, Watson basically thought that all behavior was external, and that basically we could make somebody into anything we wanted to be. It didn't matter what your genetics were or kind of what your unconscious was telling you. You were just kind of living out of these reactions to the world around you. I want to give you a quote that Watson had, and I think it really speaks to what he's trying to get at here. He says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialization. I might select a doctor, or a lawyer, an artist, a merchant, and yes, even a beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." That quote is really powerful because it's showing you just how much Watson thought our environment shaped us. He also had a test subject called Little Albert, and he actually made little Albert, through the process of classical conditioning, scared of various animals, particularly bunnies. And so poor little Albert, he was only scared of loud noises when he went to Watson, and through the course of conditioning this young child, Watson made him terrified of these young small animals. And you can watch video clips on this if you go to our course homepage. Now, secondly, there's also Skinner. Skinner is different than Watson. He's going to take more of an operant conditioning approach, where he's going to focus on rewards and punishments. Now, by focusing on rewards and punishments, all that's to say is that if you do a behavior and are rewarded for it, well, you're likely going to do that behavior again. However, if you're punished, you will likely stop. Now, this doesn't always work quite as clearly as Skinner thought, but think about in your own life. Let's say you work really hard and you get an A on a test. Well, it's likely that you will study that way again. However, if you don't work as hard, maybe you fail an exam, well, that punishment may make you change your behavior for in the future. It's likely that your parents use a lot of operant conditioning on you growing up, as they disciplined you and tried to help shape and mold your behavior. A more contemporary behaviorist theory, which is kind of merging both behaviorism and cognitive theories together, is what's called social learning theory. This is championed by Albert Bandura, who was and is a psychologist at Stanford. It's going to put a lot of emphasis on modeling and feedback. Basically, Bandura didn't just think we were products of our environment, but that we also had to think about what was going on around us. And so by watching others, we may model them. And also when people give us feedback or tell us, oh, I really liked what you did, or oh, no, you shouldn't do that again, then that will change how we act and interact with the world around us. He has this triarchic theory here where he believes our behavior is influenced by our environment and also personal factors such as how we think and how we feel. But if you notice here, these arrows are pointing toward one another, meaning how you think and feel also influences your environment and your behavior. Secondly, your environment also influences how you behave and how you think and feel. So all these factors are continuously influencing one another. I think over the course of the semester, you'll recognize that this theory has a lot of implications for your daily life. Now let's move into the last two theories. Ethology is a theory that we really won't talk about too much throughout the rest of this course other than talking about attachment. But ethology is the study of the adaptive value of behavior and its evolutionary history. It takes much more of an evolutionary approach, having kind of a Darwinian foundation, kind of this idea of the survival of the species. Lorenz was the psychologist who first studied this, and if you see him in the picture here, he had these ducks behind him, and basically he started to study young animals, particularly ducks, and he wanted to understand how they developed. And there are some key ideas here. One would be the idea of imprinting. Basically, that's the early behavior that aids in the survival of the species. So for instance, ducks stay close to their mothers as a way to survive. He also noticed that among them that there were these periods of critical development, so that a species was biologically prepared to acquire a skill during a certain period of time. And if the duck never learned it in that time, it would never learn it. Now, as we apply this to humans, we have more of what we call a sensitive period. A sensitive period in a human basically means there's an optimal time for a behavior to emerge. The most classic example of this would be attachment, which is the application of imprinting to humans. Basically, we're forming these caregiving relationships and learning to trust our caregivers in the early years of life. We know that the first 2 years of life are very sensitive to learning attachment. Is it possible to learn it after this time? Yes, but is it going to take more work? Yes, it will take more work and it may not be as natural. Another example of a sensitive period for humans would be acquiring language. We know the first 5 years are very foundational for acquiring language, and that's why if you learned a language in junior high or high school, it's likely that it was much harder for you than whenever you were a young child. The last thing would be evolutionary developmental psychology. This is basically a field of psychology and a field of human development that is understanding how we adapt as we grow and how this aids in our species. Okay, and then the last theory is the ecological systems theory. This is by Urie Bronfenbrenner, and it utilizes and is based under Lewin's equation that your behavior is representative of both who you are, your person, and the environment. So the person is kind of your inner disposition, and the environment is the world around you. So how you act is the interaction of both who you are and the world around you. And he came up with this idea of embedded systems of influence. Basically, if you've ever seen those Russian dolls and how one doll is embedded in another, which is embedded in another, that's how Bronfenbrenner created his theory. So if you look here at the theory, we start in the middle at the individual. Now this individual would be the person or their inner disposition, kind of their basic genetics, their basic elements about them. But then it is interacting with all these systems. So for instance, the microsystem would be your direct interactions, those people you have immediate relationships and contact with, such as your parents, your siblings, your peers, your school. Those are people you're in direct contact with. Now, there's another system here that is somewhat close but not entirely the same, and that's your mesosystem. The mesosystem would be those connections between people in your microsystem. So, for instance, the relationship between your parents and your teacher, Well, that's not a relationship that you have, but it does indirectly impact you. Or the relationship between your parents and a sibling. Again, not directly related to you, but it does definitely impact you. The exosystem would then be settings outside your environment, such as your parents' place of employment, maybe your broader neighborhood. These are situations that are much more indirect, but still do influence you. And then lastly, we have the macro system. That's the broader culture, beliefs, laws that are related to how you have grown up. And so, for instance, if you're growing up in the United States, that would be different than if you're growing up in parts of Europe or Australia or Africa or something like that. Bronfenbrenner's theory has been heavily utilized as a framework for understanding development. If you think about your own self, you can probably think of those elements within your microsystem, your mesosystem, your exosystem, and your macrosystem. Okay, that is a brief introduction to all the various theories of human development. I wanted to make sure that we spent some time going over them as I think they're a good foundation for the rest of this class.